Welcome to Season 5 of the Agile Brand with Greg Kihlstrom, where we talk with enterprise and technology platform leaders about the people, processes, and platforms that make marketing and customer experience successful, scalable, and sustainable. This is what creates an Agile brand. I'm your host, Greg Kihlstrom, advisor and consultant for Fortune 1000 marketing and CX leaders and teams as principal and chief strategist at GK5A, and best-selling author, keynote speaker, entrepreneur, and Agile certified coach. The Agile Brand podcast is brought to you by TEKsystems, an industry leader in full-stack technology services, talent services, and real-world application. For more information, go to teksystems.com. To sign up for the Agile Brand newsletter and get the latest insights and articles on marketing technology and CX, or to purchase a copy of my latest book, House of the Customer, go to gregkihlstrom.com. You can also find all my books on Amazon and other retailers. And now on to the show. Today we're going to talk about product agility, prioritization, and business value, and making sure that teams aren't just building efficiently, but that they're focused on the things that will drive their business forward. To help me discuss this topic, I'd like to welcome Dan Gallagher, Senior Principal, Product Leadership at Slalom. Dan, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Greg. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, looking forward to talking about this topic with you. Why don't we start by you giving a little background on yourself, as well as what you're currently doing at Slalom?
Absolutely. So my journey really began in the early 90s, kind of in the pre-World Wide Web days, as an interaction designer. In those days, it wasn't a very well-known field, but I found myself constantly being given tasks, design this button, make this thing more three-dimensional, that type of thing.
Yeah.
Being very frustrated with why are they asking me to do this? What's their overall purpose? And most of the product people who were dictating this didn't really have those answers. So as the web kind of became more mainstream, I took the opportunity to migrate into the product side of things and found myself doing what the same product people I used to curse were doing, which is basically making a lot of assumptions on what needed to be built and dictating to people what to build. And that really happened for a while until around 2003 when I came across the Agile Manifesto. And I thought it was fascinating, even though at that time, not too many people were doing it.
Yeah.
What struck me was the continuous delivery nature of Agile and the possibilities around continuous product discovery that it opened up. So I started really exploring product discovery as a continuous thing in the context of Agile, and began doing that in the context of the roles I was in. I was in originally a publishing role as a product manager, and then became a director of product in couple healthcare industry sectors, and started building out a kind of a methodology that allowed products to evolve rapidly, but not just by what we deliver on a sprint-by-sprint basis, but what we deliver on a sprint-by-sprint basis dictate what we deliver next. So kind of merging the idea of continuous delivery with continuous discovery. So that's really led me to about 4 years ago where I joined Slalom, because it really became a situation where I didn't want to just do it at one company. I wanted to spread this across multiple companies and much larger companies. And Slalom kind of gave me that platform to do it.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Yeah, I think it's always interesting hearing how people kind of get into Agile and, just some of the, whether it's pain points or opportunities or sometimes all of the above, that could just kind of lead to that. So that's really interesting. Well, we're going to talk about a few things today related to your experience with Agile. First, I wanted to point to an article, and we'll put a link in the show notes as well, but an article that you recently wrote called Stop Building the Wrong Things Faster, Reversing the Curse of Agile, which I thought was really interesting. And certainly anybody that's lived through some of the stuff that you described earlier, it's certainly hit close to home in some ways. So, we focused a lot on trying to increase efficiency and getting more out the door and, calling that velocity. But in the article, you bring up a great point that only about 20% of product features have the positive impact initially intended. So, what's wrong here? What are we missing?
Oh, it's a great call out. That building the wrong things faster actually came from a client. A few years back, we were doing an Agile transformation at a client, and he called a meeting, this SVP of technology, and said, "You guys are doing a great job. We're going to be completely Agile in 6 months." and now we're going to be building the wrong things faster. And you just fix things. So it started quite a big pivot on our part. I wasn't part of the transformation, but I quickly became part of the recast transformation. That turned out to be very successful. But really what it gets down to is, when you think about how do you judge an agile transformation? It's usually around velocity, story points per sprint, burn down, burn up, a lot of those key metrics. Those really measure outputs, right? But why do people use products? Shocker, everyone. No one's using your product because they want to use your product. They're using it because they want that outcome. They want an outcome that they seek. And as soon as someone comes along that does that, creates that outcome, enables that outcome better, faster, cheaper, they're going there because no one's loyal to your product. They're loyal to the outcome they believe they're going to get from your product. And that's where the misalignment starts. Is the Agile's focus on delivering outputs, and what the markets really need is for outcomes.
Yeah. So how do you then look at, again, efficiency is great, but efficiency without priority is, as you said, building the wrong things faster. So, how do we balance that efficiency with prioritizing the right things in the first place?
Great question. So, the analogy I like to think about it is to take things completely out of software for a second. Yeah. If a plane takes off from New York and is flying to LA, that plane has aligned on an outcome. The pilots, the flight crew, the ground crew, the air traffic coordinators, and everyone who bought a ticket is aligned on a safe arrival in LA at a certain time. It's an outcome that they've all bought into, literally.
Yeah.
So the thought is that when that plane takes off, it just points its nose to LA and there it goes. In actuality, as soon as it takes off, it pings LA and says, am I on course? Because there's so many factors of the rotation of the earth, the wind patterns, things that are going to blow it off course. It cannot control any of those forces, but it can control its relationship to the outcome. So it pings LA every 3 seconds and turns and adjusts its flight path every 3 seconds. So that plane actually flies in kind of a buzzsaw pattern across the U.S. And if it were actually measured, it's off course about 97% of the time. It's not flying in LA. Yeah. But I have a couple of daughters who live in LA. We fly out there all the time. They're almost always on time. And the reason is because they're constantly course correcting. But course correcting against the unified outcome, not just what they think they need to be. There's LA, it's moving in through the rotation of the earth and a lot of other factors, but they constantly ping it to course correct. And that's what Agile allows us to do, is it creates these incremental moments, say it's every 2 weeks at the end of each sprint, to actually course correct against an outcome. But what I think most teams forget is, or they understand the outcome at the beginning and then they put their head down and crank out outputs. They lose the sight of the outcome throughout the process, throughout the journey towards it.
Yeah. And, also just as far as prioritizing the right things in the first place, I think I see a lot of discussion about, definition of business value. I mean, certainly you could say increasing efficiency. That seems like a kind of an obvious way of increasing value to the business. But, is prioritization and sort of the challenge with prioritizing the right things, are there often fundamental either misunderstandings or maybe lack of common understanding of what business value is within, even within the same organization?
Absolutely. I think that start with business value. The biggest problem you'll find is that business value, it appears to be solid, but it's usually an assumption.
Yeah.
Why 80+% of times of products and features fail is because the value they do produce the value they intended, but that value was assumed and wasn't validated early enough.
Yeah.
Prioritization becomes, it's usually, how do you prioritize? Well, prioritize most valuable items first. Absolutely. But how do you know it's truly valuable? There's a lot of assumptions. So what the problem with this kind of fixed idea of prioritization is it doesn't allow you to validate enough along the way. So if you have a fixed outcome that you're really focused in on creating, then you have the opportunity to validate against that outcome every 2 weeks. So when you start out by, rather than here's our business value, let's go for it. Let's step back. What assumptions are we making? What are the outcomes that'll create that value? And what assumptions are we making about that path to those outcomes? And once you start to identify those assumptions, and it's amazing, we do this with teams all the time, assumption identification exercises, and they're just mind-boggled by how many assumptions they're making. The assumptions kind of tend to be desirable, assumptions around desirability, assumptions around viability, and assumptions around feasibility. And when they start to look at and identify them, they're really blown away by the sheer volume of them. And you'll see product team, the technologists say to the business people, wait a minute, that's an assumption. We thought you knew that. And vice versa. The business people say, wait a minute, you're not sure about that? How, so prioritization, better thought through, gets down to is, how do we prioritize against risk? Because all of those assumptions can be looked at through two axes. One, how important is it that the assumption be valid? Number two, how much evidence do we have that it is valid? And when you start to look at the team collectively looks at each of those assumptions through that lens, you end up with this cluster of assumptions that are very important that they're valid, number one. And number two, they don't have a lot of evidence that they are valid. Those are high risk assumptions. So prioritization may be better viewed as, how do we actually validate those first before we set off on a long-term development cycle?
Before we continue, let's take a quick break. If you're like many marketing leaders today, you're inundated with a need to improve the customer experience across an increasing number of channels and touch points, all while ensuring your team is performing well, innovating, and continuously improving. So how do you find the time to determine what's next for you, your team, your brand, and your customers? My company, GK5A, can help. Whether it is advisory services, evaluation of marketing technology platforms and solutions, or digital agencies and implementation partners, or assistance with creating strategic roadmaps and prioritization of efforts, we've done it all and served as an ally to Fortune 1000 brands in industries like financial services, healthcare, consumer electronics, professional services, and more. You can learn more about these services and contact us at www.gk5a. That's www.gk5a.com. Now let's get back to the show. The idea of business value may evolve over time. Just thinking about, the pandemic, I think that's an easy target, but 4 weeks before, all hell broke loose, maybe our definition of customer experience and, even other things about business value were very different versus, okay, everything's got to be digital and online versus, on offline and things like that. So in other words, these definitions of value or these priorities can shift frequently. So, to your point, we need a way to continuously improve not only the work that we're doing, but our definitions of business value as well as our focus and priority. So how do you do that? How do you have teams looking for these things and thinking in these ways without, just everything changing constantly? How do you balance that need to reassess with still getting the right things done?
Right. It's a great question. So first of all, I think that one of the problems we see with teams and organization is the mindset, right?
Yeah.
I probably yourself have been successful over the course of a long career because we've delivered things on time and on budget, right? That's a very output-centric view, right? No one, whoever we delivered that for didn't need whatever we delivered. What they needed was the outcome they thought they were going to get from it.
Yeah.
And quite often, I know in my case, a lot of times we did not be able to do that, right? We thought we did, but we delivered it, and guess what? We weren't completely right, or we were out and out wrong. The first step is to understand outcomes, right? There's an objective, and then what are the outcomes that'll enable that objective? Don't stop there. How do you make those outcomes more granular so the team can take action against it? One of the great things there's an exercise we do with teams, done it hundreds of times now. called objective survival. And using that same airplane analogy, the team, we use a room of like, say, 6 teams is the average, and about half dozen people per team. And the idea is that that plane did not use this course correction mindset across from New York to LA, and actually flew out over Canada and crashed in the mountains. They were each on a separate plane. And they have 12 objects now to prioritize. How important are these objects? Like an axe, a can of Crisco, a ball of steel wool, an empty lighter, a bottle of whiskey, things like that. And we have them prioritize those as a team. What we do make it a little interesting is we take, say, there's 6 teams. 3 of them are staying with the plane in the mountains in the middle of the winter. The other 3 teams have to actually find their way to a town that's about 35 miles away. What's interesting is there's 12 items. Not surprisingly, the teams that stayed with the plane had a similar prioritization list to each other, but radically different than the ones who left. So if the objective is to survive, their strategies were different. But what gets really interesting for us is that we then redo it. We actually talk to them about outcomes. Okay, your objective is to survive. The outcomes that will enable you to survive, you need to stay warm. You need to stay hydrated. You need to stay nourished. You need to signal for help. You start to break that overall objective of survival down into outcomes. And then we have them rate those objects on how they'll contribute to each individual outcome. Then they each redo their prioritization list. And every single time we've done this, they are completely different.
Wow. Yeah.
What's changed from the first time they did it to the second time they did it? People did not change. The scenario, the circumstances did not change. All we did was bring them a little more clarity around the outcomes. We made the outcomes more granular that they can relate to. It's the idea that when you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change. So making outcomes, building a shared understanding about granularity of outcomes is really, really important.
Yeah. That's great. Yeah. In another post, you mentioned something else that I thought was interesting. It's the concept of the product flywheel. Do you mind explaining that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's the idea of a feature funnel. A lot of companies, actually I was with a client the other day and they were like, we need to redesign our process. We want a funnel of all ideas to funnel into this funnel, and then we'll decide which ones are the most important ones. And then we'll drop it into a roadmap and we're off and running. Well, I had trouble time helping them understand that that's probably not the best way to do it. Because when you think about things as a funnel, what you're really doing is you're rating things through a series of, usually a rubric or something like that is assumption laced throughout. And a lot of times these assumptions are hiding in plain sight. Then they hit a roadmap. And that roadmap, once they hit a roadmap, they're it, right? The problem with roadmaps is they tend to be a listing of outputs, right? So we're going to deliver feature A, B, and C in Q2 and D, E, and F in Q3. That's kind of the way roadmaps tend to work. That's a very output-centric way to think about it. It's also gives the team the out to say, all right, well, we're adhering to long-term planning, as opposed to understanding that they really should be on a learning journey and identifying and validating the assumptions towards outcomes continuously. So the idea of a flywheel really came in. There's something called the Amazon flywheel or the Amazon virtuous circle. Yeah. So the idea that it really is what Amazon started in the late 90s focusing and building on. And the idea is that they want a great customer experience. You hear that a lot, right? And that's usually the center of things for companies, which I'll get to in a minute. But what their flywheel is, with great customer service, why do we want that? Because we want to drive more traffic, the next point in their flywheel. Why do we want more traffic? Because we'll attract more sellers. That's the next point in their flywheel. And then the fourth point in their flywheel, more sellers creates more selection, right? It doesn't stop there, because what does more selection do? It creates a better customer experience, which drives more traffic, which brings more sellers, and so on and so on. So each element, each kind of outcome in the flywheel drives to the next. And what's in the center of that flywheel is growth, right? Not customer experience, everything. Customer experience, you can have a great customer experience and not grow as a company. So it's understanding that it's a cycle that you're driving towards. So in the context of your question, the flywheel in this case is really the idea of you need to continuously deliver, and that's where agile is critical. But you need to continuously discover and then continuously validate. At the center of that flywheel is continuous flow of value.
Yeah.
It's such a popular thing to say we want to be customer centric. I don't know what that means. Well, I do know what I think it means. But if you and I could talk for an hour about what customer centric is, and we might agree on some parts, we might not. But inevitably, when a client says that, and there are more than one in a room, I ask them to say what they mean, and they seldom agree. It's a kind of a catchy thing to say, but do you really want to be customer centric? To what end? You want to be customer centric so that you probably want to grow, right? And that's what Amazon was able to do. And that's a key, by the way, when you want to get to an outcome, is by asking the question, so that, right? We need to move this product to the cloud so that we need to, save hosting costs or whatever. But it's getting out of this kind of this buzzword bingo of we're going to be customer centric. Let's understand that what we really want is growth. What we really want is a continuous flow of value. That's what we need to center on and understand what are the features that will help drive us? What's the types of products that will help drive the key elements that we need within our flywheel that will drive the growth or the continuous flow of value?
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, that's really interesting because, I mean, definitely lots of organizations are talking about customer centricity. And, I think some of it may be what you're talking about ties the customer experience to value. I mean, it ties it directly to value. I think some organizations have struggled to tie improvements to CX to, increase in business outcomes and things like that. And so I like the idea of the flywheel concept because it's instead of separating customer experience even if they're touching in a diagram or something, it actually ties it directly to the process as opposed to it being an outcome or some kind of tangentially related thing. So that's interesting.
Yeah, exactly. You can't grow in virtually any industry. You really can't grow rapidly without a good customer experience.
Right.
Right. It's hard to do that. And the better the customer experience, the better it's going to be for growth. But it's important to keep the idea of the customer experience and being customer centric in the context of what your true objective is, which is usually something like growth or continuous flow of value or something along those lines.
Right. Which is in the best interest of the customer some of that you already, explained in the context of Amazon, all of those other pieces. Yes, it benefits the business, but it also benefits the customer to have more variety and more sellers and everything. And that's, I think in my experience, that's how customer experience actually works is when it benefits. If it's a loss to the company to have good customer experience, then it's not going to be sustainable and so on and so forth. So tying it into the value chain like that makes perfect sense. Yeah.
The other thing I hear a lot is we want to delight our customers. And that's another kind of thing I think people throw out there without really thinking about what they're actually saying. It comes back to what I started talking about originally, outcomes. No one's using your product because they want to use it. They're using it because they want an outcome. You want to delight your customers. Focus on the outcome and they seek. Understand the outcome in ways that not even they do. And that's how you create transformational products. Delight comes to the fulfillment of an outcome. Now, the easier your product fulfills that outcome, that's even more delight. But understanding that the customer experience has to start with an understanding of the outcome they seek. Not so much, the journey to that outcome through your product is important, but a great journey to a bad outcome is not a good customer experience. They won't be delighted.
Yeah, no, that's great point. Well, Dan, thanks so much for joining today. I've got one last question before we wrap up here, and you've already given a lot of great advice today. But when you think about it, what's one piece of advice you'd have for organizations that maybe they can do today, or at least get started towards prioritizing the right things, prioritizing the right product features, the right parts of the experience and focusing on the most high value things?
Yeah, I think that, I think first of all, product teams, in especially in agile environments, need to understand that really what they're saying is, hey, user, we have a better outcome for you. But to get it, you'll need to change your behavior in some way, right? It's almost like a transaction. So a lot of products will fail, not because they were bad ideas, but maybe the outcome wasn't valuable enough to the user for the behavior change that they required to get it, right? So Uber is a great example. What Uber did was amazing. They got us to completely change our behavior for a better outcome. Right now, we download their app, we input our credit card, we create an account. We now flag down someone we don't know and go out on the sidewalk and get in their car, right? That is significant behavior change. But the outcome, they convinced us and they delivered that the outcome it was worth it for us behavior change. So what I would recommend is for teams and organizations to think about what are the outcomes and what behavior changes are we going to have force our users to do or bring them along to do to get to that value exchange of our new product. So it's a different way of thinking than most teams who just think about how do I get this done on time within budget? And that's not really your job. Your job is to create a different outcome.
Yeah, that's great. Well, wonderful. I'd like to thank Dan Gallagher, Senior Principal, Product Leadership at Slalom, for joining the show. You can learn more about Dan and Slalom, and we'll put some links to those blog posts I mentioned as well by following the links in the show notes. Thanks again for listening to the Agile Brand with Greg Kihlstrom podcast, brought to you by Tech Systems. If you enjoyed the show, please take a minute to subscribe on your podcast channel of choice and leave us a rating so that others can find the show more easily. You can access more episodes of the show at www.gregkihlstrom.com. That's GREGKIHLSTROM.com. To get a copy of my latest book, House of the Customer, visit my website, or you can find it on Amazon or other retailers. The Agile Brand is produced by Missing Link, a Latina-owned, strategy-driven, creatively fueled production co-op. From ideation to creation, they craft human connections through intelligent, engaging, and informative content. Until next time, stay agile.